Hi, Scott Livingston here from ReconditioningHQ.com, and today what I'm going to talk about is the concept of training modality. And we're going to look at a single leg RDL. Some people call it an airplane. Basically, it's a hip flexion on a single leg. We're working the flexion from the ground-based support position, and what we want to do is basically work the flexion motion with an extension overload. So we're going through a single leg RDL forward. The loading is on the extension aspect of the motion. So it's a real good exercise for training the posterior chain through extension, working pelvic flexion and hip flexion. So we have control of those two things, that co-contraction activation that works when we have to flex the pelvis. And so we have different modalities that we can choose to use in applying this exercise. So I'm going to show you three modalities that we can choose. One is a cable. In this case, we're using a pneumatic overload with the Kaiser. You can use an elastic band or you can use a dumbbell. I'm going to show all three and then come back and talk a little bit. Whilst I'm doing it, I'll also talk. So if we take a look at the classic dumbbell single leg RDL, I pick up my dumbbell, I have it in my hand, I take my opposite leg and lock it back. I'm going to drop through that single leg RDL pattern and then drive up through. And I can work different tempos of that, but essentially the load meets me quite significantly here, and it's the initiation point that this load is at its finest for me from an overload perspective. When I get up into the high range, there's not much work happening. So my work is happening as I lower, there's an eccentric overload, and then the initiation, and then we lose some of that resistance as we come through that range of motion. So if we go and we use the pneumatic overload for consistent cable overload, what we now have is a load in front of us that's pulling us towards the stack. In this instance, there's load immediately upon me, and it continues to be on me as I go through the entire motion. And then when I have to initiate, that load remains consistent throughout the entire motion. So I'm overloaded, braking through the eccentric phase, and then as I go through the concentric phase, I'm overloaded continuously. In the last one with an elastic, if I'm using an elastic as a modality, as I start, same way with the cable stack, I have an overload. As I get closer towards the fixed point of the elastic diminishes in resistance. So I don't have as much resistance in the eccentric phase, and when I want to initiate, my resistance is going to be less than when I pull through. So as I go forward, it reduces. As I start to pull through, it increases at the end. So if I want to work that hip extension mechanism with an overload that's increasing, that's going to be a great modality for that. So running, hip extension off the running, that contact point, and elastic might be a really neat type of modality to use. If I have a sport or event where the initiation of motion out of extension from that deep position is going to be valuable, maybe in a throws athlete, etc., then using a dumbbell is going to have a greater effect. So we want to use modality to affect an overload associated with the realities of or phenomenons of what we're going to use it for. There can be the spicing up of change, absolutely, but there's also the benefits or the lack of benefit in each particular modality. So you should know the value proposition of each modality, what you're using it for and why, and when you would inject it into the program or not. That's modality for you today. Hope this helps. If you got any comments, drop them in the box or share it out to people. Thanks very much for listening.